When the fighting finally ceased across the European continent, thousands upon thousands of defeated German soldiers found themselves loaded onto massive transport vessels, crossing the grey Atlantic waters toward a land most of them had never imagined visiting. This was June of 1945, and the holds of those ships carried men who had surrendered in France, been captured in the collapsing Ruhr pocket, or given up arms in the Italian campaign. They shuffled down gangplanks onto American docks, blinking in unfamiliar sunlight, before being herded into trucks and trains that would carry them deeper into the heart of their captors' territory. The journey took them through landscapes they had only seen in propaganda films, past fields so vast they seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, through cities that showed no scars of bombing, until finally they arrived at camps scattered across Kansas, Texas, Iowa, and other states whose names they could barely pronounce. Dust clouds rose around their worn boots as they marched through camp gates, their uniforms hanging loosely on frames that had grown gaunt during the final desperate months of the war. Weeks of shrinking rations had left them hollow, their belts cinched tighter than regulation allowed, their faces carrying the sunken look of men who had learned to expect less each day. Yet despite the physical toll, despite the obvious fact of their defeat, something remained unbroken in many of them. It showed in the way certain officers held their shoulders back, in the dismissive glances they cast at their captors, in the sneers that still played across their lips when they thought the Americans were not watching closely enough. Pride, it seemed, could survive on less sustenance than the human body required. In the barracks where they were housed, conversations carried that particular mixture of bitterness and superiority that defeated men sometimes cling to when victory in arms has been stripped away. They spoke of what they had lost, yes, but also of what they believed they still possessed, a cultural refinement, a sense of order and tradition that no battlefield reverse could take from them. When word began to spread through the camp that the Americans intended to feed them in something called a cafeteria, the reaction was immediate and dismissive. Laughter rippled through the cramped quarters where men sat on rough bunks, the sound carrying an edge of contempt that needed no translation. A lieutenant who had served in Hamburg before the war, a man whose family had operated a respected restaurant for 3 generations, spoke loudly enough for others to hear his verdict on this American institution. His voice dripped with derision as he announced that such a word could only refer to the cheapest sort of tavern, or perhaps the kind of common lunchroom where school children might be herded to eat whatever slop was cheapest that day. The Americans, he declared, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never actually visited America, understood nothing whatsoever about the proper rituals of the table. Their meals, he continued, were undoubtedly as crude and childish as everything else their culture produced. Their garish films, their loud music, their tasteless approach to everything that required sophistication and restraint. His fellow officers and some of the enlisted men nodded along, adding their own observations to build a collective picture of American dining that satisfied their need to feel superior in at least this one domain. Only in Germany, they assured one another, was the act of eating treated as the art form it truly was, with dignity maintained and protocols observed even when shells were falling and cities burning. The deep irony embedded in these pronouncements seemed to escape them entirely, or perhaps they simply chose not to acknowledge it. The truth was that many of these same men had not consumed what anyone might reasonably call a full meal in months. Bread had become a precious commodity back home, rationed so severely that families learned to make a single loaf stretch across days. Potatoes, once so abundant they were taken for granted, had been distributed with miserly care. Meat had virtually disappeared from civilian tables, and even military rations had dwindled to portions that left men weak and distracted by constant hunger. Yet somehow, in the face of this recent history of deprivation, pride burned brighter than honest recollection. Their memories reached back past the shortages to earlier times. to the oak-paneled officer mess halls they had known before everything began to crumble, rooms where white tablecloths were laid with precision and sausages were arranged with an eye for presentation, where wine bottles were opened with proper ceremony, even if the wine inside had grown thin and sour. What mattered was not the substance, but the performance, the visible demonstration of hierarchy and order that turned a meal into a ritual of rank and discipline. To their way of thinking, dining was not simply about satisfying physical hunger. It represented something far more important than mere nutrition. It was about establishing and maintaining social order, about showing respect for tradition, about demonstrating that civilization itself could be preserved in the smallest gestures of a fork lifted just so, or a glass raised in measured toast. They assumed without question that the Americans possessed none of this understanding, that the crude descendants of shopkeepers and farmers could not possibly comprehend what generations of European culture had refined into proper table manners. What these prisoners did not know, what they could not have imagined even if they tried, was that by 1944, the United States Quartermaster Corps had engineered and perfected a logistical system for feeding people that exceeded anything in human history. The Americans had learned to supply not merely their own soldiers fighting on 3 separate continents, but also the millions of prisoners who had fallen into their custody, and they did this with a casual efficiency that would have seemed impossible to any previous generation. In that single year, American farms had produced over 24 billion pounds of meat, a number so large it lost meaning when spoken aloud. Flour mills across the Midwest churned out more than 120 million barrels of wheat flour, while entire freight trains thundered through the plains carrying nothing but milk, vegetables, and refined sugar. The scale of this productive capacity was not ritual or ceremony or carefully maintained hierarchy. It was industrial might translated directly into sustenance, the ability to feed armies and enemies alike without apparent strain. The prisoners, of course, knew nothing of these figures and would not have believed them if told. They continued to laugh among themselves, constructing elaborate fantasies of the humiliation that surely awaited them. They imagined being handed battered tin cups and served watered soup that barely qualified as liquid, perhaps accompanied by a single slice of dry bread that would crumble at the touch. A young private, barely old enough to need a daily shave, muttered his certainty that the Americans would treat them like cattle, forcing them to eat from a communal pot with a single shared spoon, stripping away any last shred of dignity. The image seemed to satisfy something in him, a way to prepare for the worst while maintaining the comfort of feeling superior even in anticipated degradation. Other voices chimed in with their own predictions, each more dismissive than the last, building a collective expectation of crude treatment that would at least confirm their beliefs about American vulgarity. Even hunger, even the gnawing emptiness that had become their constant companion over recent months, could not silence this smugness. They believed with absolute conviction that America was too crude, too brash, too fundamentally uncivilized to understand what a proper meal should represent. They wrapped themselves in this belief like a threadbare blanket, finding warmth in it even as their stomachs clenched with need. And so the stage assembled itself without anyone quite realizing what was about to occur. On one side stood these sneering prisoners, men hollowed out by hunger, yet still wrapped tightly in the cocoon of their arrogance, convinced that whatever awaited them would only confirm their sense of cultural superiority. On the other side, behind doors they had not yet entered, waited something that would shake their confidence more thoroughly than any defeat on any battlefield had managed to do. What lay beyond those cafeteria doors, gleaming under bright electric lights that never flickered, was not the humiliation they expected. It was instead a revelation, a demonstration of power expressed not in guns or bombs, but in the simple, overwhelming fact of abundance. and it would echo in their memories for decades to come, long after other details of the war had faded into generalized recollection. Years later, old men would struggle to describe what they felt in that moment when the doors swung open, when expectation met reality and pride encountered its mirror. That first night in captivity crawled past with the usual mixture of exhaustion and smoldering resentment that characterized defeated men trying to sleep in unfamiliar places. They lay on bunks that were not quite comfortable, but far from the worst they had experienced, listening to the sounds of an American night, the distant hum of generators, the footsteps of guards making rounds, the occasional bark of orders in that flat Midwestern accent that sounded nothing like the English they had studied in school. As morning light filtered through the barracks windows and they rose to face another day of uncertainty, they carried with them that curious pride rooted not in recent victory, which they obviously lacked, but in the sustaining power of memory. What they missed most acutely was not the camaraderie of the battlefield or the thrill of advancing through enemy territory. What haunted them in quiet moments was the ritual of the German table, the ceremonies of eating that had structured their sense of who they were and where they belonged in the world. In their minds, even the simplest military mess hall back home had carried an air of ceremony that elevated it above mere feeding. There was order in every gesture, they recalled, a prescribed sequence that everyone understood without needing to speak it aloud. Officers were always seated first, their rank giving them priority not just in portions, but in the very act of sitting down. Hands were folded before eating began, a moment of stillness that acknowledged something larger than individual appetite. Sausages and cabbage were served with measured care, and sometimes, if fortune had smiled and supplies allowed, there might even be a small ration of wine to accompany the meal. They remembered the sharp clatter of boots across floors that had been polished to a mirror shine, the smell of tobacco smoke curling lazily through the air after the meal was finished, the way silence was enforced until the senior officer present lifted his fork to signal that eating could commence. These memories carried weight far beyond their literal content. This was more than food consumption. It represented hierarchy made visible, discipline expressed through the smallest actions, identity confirmed with every measured bite. Even now, in defeat, even confined behind wire and under guard, these men clung to the belief that German meals embodied a sophistication, a cultural refinement that set them apart from and above the crude and noisy habits they imagined awaited them in America. In the barracks, as men performed the small tasks of making themselves presentable for another day in captivity, the conversation circled endlessly around these themes. A captain from Bavaria, a man whose family owned land that had been farmed for generations, took it upon himself to remind the younger soldiers of certain truths he felt they needed to keep in mind. The Americans, he announced, with the patient tone of someone explaining the obvious, believe that quantity equals culture. They think that more is always better, that piling plates high somehow compensates for the absence of refinement. He insisted that Germans, even while their cities were being reduced to rubble by Allied bombers, had never abandoned the essential dignity of dining. Linen cloths were still laid when possible, he claimed. Toasts were still raised to fallen comrades. Rules still governed the table, making it an extension of the officer corps itself rather than a simple feeding station. In his telling, food in Germany might have been scarce, desperately scarce in those final months, but this very scarcity gave ritual even greater meaning. The act of eating became not just about survival, but about maintaining civilization itself, a performance of pride in the face of deprivation. The younger prisoners listened to these speeches, some nodding along while others remained silent with their own thoughts. Many thought of home in these moments, of mothers who had somehow managed to lay out steaming potatoes on chipped plates that had survived when everything else was broken or sold, of fathers who sliced bread with such deliberate care that you could see concentration in every movement of the knife. These memories carried an aura of superiority that nothing could quite dispel, a conviction that Germans had always eaten with more refinement than Americans ever could or would. The word cafeteria still tasted strange and foreign in their mouths when they spoke it. They used the term mockingly, investing it with contempt, as if they were describing some kind of carnival booth where cheap food was distributed without dignity or order. They could not begin to imagine that within a matter of hours, this carefully maintained pride would begin to falter, that the precious rituals they remembered and cherished would suddenly feel small, almost fragile, when confronted with something operating on a completely different scale. What these prisoners did not yet understand, what they had no framework for comprehending, was that America's fundamental strength lay not in ritual or ceremony or the careful maintenance of social hierarchies at the dinner table. American power was rooted in abundance itself, in the sheer productive capacity to generate food in quantities that made scarcity seem like a choice rather than a natural condition. The strength was not in hierarchy but in scale, not in refined performance but in the raw ability to feed millions without apparent effort. For the German prisoners, this would prove to be the cruelest possible twist of memory. The tables they longed for, with their elaborate rituals and their reinforcement of pride and place, would suddenly feel small and almost pathetically insignificant when confronted with the bright, roaring, fundamentally democratic machine of an American cafeteria. And so they waited in their barracks, and then in formation, and finally in line, their stomachs growling with an intensity that made concentration difficult, still absolutely certain that they knew what it meant to dine with dignity, still completely unaware that the next door they would pass through represented not just a mess hall or feeding station, but something more profound. It was a mirror reflecting the true difference between two worlds, two systems, two entirely different ways of understanding what power meant and how it could be expressed. The door waited for them, and behind it waited a lesson they had never anticipated. The midday whistle blew across the camp with a piercing insistence that made men stop whatever small tasks occupied them. Guards began calling out in their American accents, ordering the prisoners to assemble for the noon meal. Rows of weary Germans shuffled forward through the dust, boots scuffing against gravel that crunched with each step, the sun hanging overhead and beating down with an intensity that made them squint. They followed the line of men ahead of them, expecting at any moment to arrive at whatever crude feeding arrangements the Americans had established. Perhaps they would find a large pot of thin stew, the kind of watery concoction that provided warmth without much nutrition, to be ladled into dented tin cups or bowls. Some prepared themselves mentally for even less, for bread and water, for the absolute minimum that international conventions required captors to provide. Yet as they turned a corner around one of the camp buildings and approached what they had been told was the mess area, what awaited them looked nothing like humiliation or deprivation. The cafeteria doors stood open before them, and as the first prisoners reached the threshold and could see inside, they simply froze in place, creating a momentary traffic jam as those behind pressed forward with confusion. Before them stretched a hall that blazed with electric light, so bright it seemed almost aggressive after months of living in shadows and ruins. Rows of polished tables extended down the length of the building, their surfaces gleaming beneath fluorescent bulbs that hummed with steady electric current, their order precise and geometric, creating lines that drew the eye irresistibly forward. Along one entire side of the hall ran what could only be called the serving line, an installation of stainless steel counters that reflected and multiplied the light, their surfaces so clean they looked almost wet, the heat rising from great pans of food, creating visible distortions in the air above them. Steam curled upward in lazy spirals from trays of beef stew that actually contained recognizable chunks of meat, from mounds of mashed potatoes that had been whipped until they formed peaks, while loaves of bread sat stacked in quantities higher than any prisoner had seen since before the war began, possibly higher than they had ever seen in their entire lives. The sight carried an almost cinematic quality, overwhelming in its visual impact, as if someone had carefully staged the entire scene specifically to shock men who had grown accustomed to living in shadows and making do with scraps. Green beans glistened under the bright lamps, their color so vivid they looked artificial, while cakes had been arranged in neat rows, their frosting catching the light. Pitchers of milk stood ready in formation like soldiers at attention, accompanied by huge urns of coffee from which steam rose in visible columns, all waiting to be poured into cups that were neither chipped nor cracked. The air itself carried a physical weight, laden with the warmth of roasted meat and the sweetness of baked goods, smells so rich and complex they seemed almost tangible, like something you could reach out and touch. For a long moment, silence fell among the prisoners like a heavy curtain, their practiced arrogance faltering and then failing entirely under the sheer sensory assault of abundance. A young corporal who had been laughing moments earlier now whispered in a voice barely audible, "This is for prisoners," as if saying it aloud might help him believe it, might make the scene before him make sense in some framework he could understand. Another soldier, a boy barely 20 years old with peach fuzz still on his cheeks, blinked rapidly and repeatedly, his eyes squeezing shut and opening again, as though he feared this vision might vanish like a mirage the moment he stopped concentrating on it. Their gazes darted nervously toward the American guards, half expecting to see laughter or mockery, waiting for the reveal of whatever cruel joke was being played on them. But the Americans simply gestured casually toward the trays stacked at the beginning of the line, their body language impatient and businesslike, as though this enormous mountain of food was entirely ordinary. Nothing remarkable at all, just another routine lunch service like any other day. The contrast was absolutely devastating for anyone capable of recognizing it. Only months earlier, some of these same men had stood in Berlin's endless ration lines, waiting for hours in the cold for the possibility of obtaining a scrap of bread or a cup of thin turnip soup, and now, in captivity, imprisoned by the enemy, they faced more food in a single glance than they had seen cumulatively in weeks. The polished steel trays reflected not just the steam rising from hot food, but an image of America itself, a vision of industrial might translated seamlessly into sustenance, of power measured not in tanks or planes, but in calories and cups of milk. Behind them in line, a Luftwaffe sergeant who had flown missions over England until his aircraft was shot down, clenched his jaw tightly, unwilling to let the men under his informal command see anything that might be interpreted as awe in his expression. But even his practiced composure faltered visibly as the line lurched into motion and the distinctive clatter of steel trays rang through the air like a bell, marking the beginning of something irreversible. For in that precise moment, the proud rituals of German dining that they had been discussing just hours earlier, the carefully preserved traditions of sausages and wine, the toasts and enforced silence, the hierarchy made visible through seating arrangements, all of it seemed almost quaint and old-fashioned, fragile concepts from another era, entirely when confronted with the massive scale of this glowing hall. The men stood on the edge of something that went far beyond the simple satisfaction of hunger. They stood before a revelation about power and resources and the fundamental nature of the conflict they had just lost, and as they took their first hesitant steps across the threshold, as the first among them reached out to take hold of a shining American tray, heavy and solid and real in their hands, they began to realize with a sinking feeling in their chests that what they had mocked only hours before, what they had dismissed as crude American vulgarity, was about to strip away the very pride they had managed to carry with them across the ocean and through the gates of captivity. The line shuffled forward with a mechanical rhythm, each reluctant step echoing against the spotless tile floor that had been mopped so clean it reflected blurred images of the men walking across it. The guards handed out trays with casual efficiency, cold steel that felt substantial in trembling hands, and pointed without ceremony toward the serving counters where steam continued to rise like offerings on some pagan altar. What happened next would bewilder and disorient the Germans more thoroughly than any weapon they had faced across all the battlefields of the war. There was no single enormous pot into which undifferentiated food was carelessly dumped. No officer standing at attention and barking orders about who could eat and how much they were permitted. Instead, they witnessed something that struck them as almost anarchic in its lack of visible hierarchy. They saw an orderly flow of individual choice, a system where each man walked forward at his own pace, slid his tray along a metal rail worn smooth by countless previous trays, and then was presented with options. A spoonful of potatoes if he wanted them, or he could pass them by if he preferred. Beef stew or chicken, presented side by side without any indication of which was superior or intended for higher ranks. A slice of bread, then a choice between butter or jam or both, if that was his desire. The rhythm was indeed mechanical, the product of industrial thinking applied to food service, yet it was also strangely democratic in a way that unsettled men accustomed to rigid hierarchy, a production line of nourishment where each individual became, at least temporarily, his own master, making his own decisions about what would go on his plate. One prisoner, a man who had served in Russia and seen things he tried not to remember, muttered in genuine disbelief that could not be entirely suppressed, "We may choose what we eat," as if this simple fact represented a violation of natural law. The guard standing nearby simply nodded, not understanding the German words but recognizing the tone of amazed discovery. Another prisoner of war whispered to his neighbor in line, "They permit us the same as American soldiers receive," and the idea struck them with more force than the smell of roasted meat, more impact than the sight of gleaming vegetables. Choice was a privilege they had not imagined extending to prisoners, to defeated enemies who by all traditional logic should be grateful for whatever scraps might be tossed their way. In the Wehrmacht and before that in civilian life under the regime, rations had always been handed down from above without discussion or debate. You ate what was given to you, no questions asked, no alternatives offered. Here, in captivity, imprisoned by the nation they had been taught to despise as soft and undisciplined, they were confronted with the unsettling freedom to decide for themselves. Cornbread or biscuits, carrots or beans, coffee or milk, or perhaps both, each decision small in itself, but cumulatively representing something that challenged their entire understanding of how hierarchical systems were supposed to function. Some hesitated with hands hovering over serving spoons, as if reaching for too much might spring some hidden trap, might reveal this as the elaborate cruel joke they had been half expecting all along. A few men actually looked back nervously over their shoulders at their comrades, as if seeking permission, or at least confirmation, that it was acceptable to take advantage of what was being offered. But as the line continued to move with its relentless forward progress, as more and more trays began to fill with steaming, colorful portions, hesitation gradually gave way to something that might have been wonder if these men had been willing to admit such a feeling. Trays filled until they were heavy with food, plates arranged with vegetables and meat and bread, and even desserts, steaming and colorful and abundant, as though the very concept of hunger and scarcity had been banished completely from this particular corner of the world. The irony was brutal enough to hurt if you allowed yourself to think about it clearly. Back home in the cities and towns they had left behind, families struggled to survive on meager slices of bread that had to be eked out over days. Children shared bowls of watery soup and learned not to ask for seconds that did not exist. Mothers perform miracles of stretching tiny rations across too many mouths. Yet here, on the other side of the world, the defeated enemy could stand in line and select between multiple options, could exercise choice and agency in a manner that should have been reserved for free men rather than prisoners. The cafeteria embodied something these men had not been prepared to encounter or process. It represented abundance, linked inextricably with liberty, two concepts they had been trained to see as opposites rather than complements. Each tray that passed down the line was a silent lecture, a demonstration without words that in America even prisoners, even enemies who had fought to destroy everything America represented could be permitted to exercise choice and walk away with dignity and fullness. It was democracy translated directly into food, a weapon without gunpowder, but no less devastating than artillery shells for what it revealed about the vast gulf between two systems. As they finally sat down at those polished tables, as forks began to clatter against plates and the first tastes of food touched tongues that had grown accustomed to disappointment, the prisoners glanced at one another with expressions that mixed unease and confusion, and something that might have been shame. Pride and disbelief tangled in throats that were trying to swallow both food and implications that went far beyond nutrition. One man, an officer who had studied philosophy before the war, derailed his academic career, whispered to his neighbor that they had expected to be humiliated by deprivation and cruelty. "But what is this if not humiliation of a different kind entirely?" he asked. "Humiliation through generosity, through the demonstration that our enemy possesses resources so vast that even feeding us abundantly costs them nothing worth measuring." For the first time since they had arrived at the camp, the laughter that had filled the barracks and traveled with them in formation was completely gone. In its place came the quiet confusion of men being forced to see freedom and power expressed not in grandiose speeches or propaganda banners or military parades, but in something as simple and undeniable as the steaming haze rising from their own plates, in the weight of a tray heavy with food, in the revolutionary idea that even a prisoner might choose jam instead of butter if that was his preference. The first bites of actual food created a silence in the hall that was almost religious in its intensity. Forks scraped gently against trays as men tasted what they had so recently mocked and dismissed as beneath their standards. A private from Bremen, a young man who had not tasted actual meat since the brutal winter of 1944, when the rations had shrunk to almost nothing, closed his eyes as beef stew coated his tongue, and he allowed himself just for a moment to forget where he was and why he was there. Another soldier, deeply skeptical of the pale spread the Americans called peanut butter, something he had never encountered in his life, dipped a corner of bread into it experimentally, grimaced at the unfamiliar texture and sweetness, then found himself reaching for more, despite his initial reaction. The sneers that had characterized their earlier conversation dissolved into focused chewing, eyes darting around the table to see who among them would be the first to openly admit what they were all experiencing. Within minutes of sitting down, the careful order and discipline of the line began to break down in small ways. Men who had finished their initial portions rose awkwardly from their seats, trays still clutched in hands that seemed reluctant to let them go, and drifted almost sheepishly back toward the serving counters. The guards looked on with expressions of faint amusement that they tried to hide, watching as the same Germans who had laughed at American cafeterias just that morning returned shamefacedly for second helpings, unable to resist the simple availability of more. One Luftwaffe officer, a man known for his strict adherence to protocol and propriety, muttered under his breath to his comrade as they both stood in line again. In Germany, even civilians are starving in the streets, reduced to eating things that should not be eaten. Yet here, even captives eat until they are satisfied and then return for more. His words spread quietly through the hall, repeated like a confession that needed to be shared, passing from table to table in whispers. The atmosphere underwent a subtle but unmistakable shift as the meal progressed. The first meal had been pure shock, the body and mind overwhelmed by sensory input that contradicted every expectation. But this second helping, this willing return to the line for more, represented something different. It was surrender, not of arms which had already occurred, but of pride, of the carefully maintained fiction that German culture was somehow superior in all the ways that truly mattered. A sergeant who only the previous evening had lectured younger men on the refinement and sophistication of German dining traditions now shoveled cornbread into his mouth with an almost boyish enthusiasm, crumbs catching in the stubble on his chin. A young private licked frosting from his fingers with unself-conscious pleasure, whispering to anyone who would listen that it tasted sweeter than any ration cake his mother had managed to create by stretching ingredients across an entire month. In the barracks later that night, after the meal had ended and they had been marched back to their quarters, men laughed, but the laughter had changed. They were no longer laughing at the Americans with their supposed vulgarity and lack of culture. Instead, they found themselves laughing nervously at their own expense, at how quickly and completely hunger had defeated their elaborate constructions of arrogance, at how thin and fragile that pride had proven to be when confronted with actual abundance. Yet gossip and rumor festered as well, spreading through the cramped spaces between bunks as men tried to process what they had experienced. Some muttered darkly that the abundance must be a trick of some kind, that the Americans had staged this enormous bounty specifically to weaken German resolve, to make them doubt what they had been fighting for. It was psychological warfare, these conspiracy theorists insisted, a carefully calculated demonstration designed to make them forget their loyalty and their principles. Others took a different approach, claiming bitterly that the United States was simply wasting food on a criminal scale while the whole of Europe bled and starved, and that such waste was not a sign of strength, but rather proof of decadence and moral decay. "Look at how they pile food on plates with no thought for tomorrow," one man argued, as if resources were infinite, as if there would never be a reckoning for such excess. But for most of the prisoners, for the ordinary soldiers who had no investment in elaborate theories or face-saving explanations, the memory of that first cafeteria meal would not fade easily or quickly. It would remain vivid for reasons they could not entirely articulate, because it had filled not merely their stomachs, which had been empty for so long, but also their imagination, forcing them to reconsider assumptions they had never questioned before. What they did not know, what they could not know because the information was not available to them, was that United States agriculture had reached a scale of production unprecedented in human history. In 1945 alone, American farms had produced over 55 billion quarts of milk, a number so vast it became meaningless to anyone trying to visualize it. Sugar beet fields stretched across the Midwest like white oceans, extending to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. The cafeteria was not a performance staged for their benefit. It was simply the natural byproduct of a system that had learned to generate food abundance on a scale that dwarfed anything Europe had ever achieved. To the prisoners sitting in their barracks and arguing about what it all meant, every slice of cake they had eaten, every glass of milk they had drunk, stood as proof of something they were reluctant to admit openly. It was proof that the war had been lost long before they personally had surrendered, lost not on any particular battlefield, but in the fundamental competition of systems and resources. That night, as darkness settled over the camp and men lay on their bunks trying to find sleep, arguments continued in whispers. Was America strong because of its superior weapons and tactics? One man asked. Or was it strong because of its food, because of its ability to feed both armies and enemies without strain? Could an empire built on sheer abundance ever be defeated by one that glorified discipline and sacrifice and making do with less? The questions hung in the air without easy answers. A captain lay on his bunk, staring up at the ceiling in the darkness, unable to formulate a response that satisfied him, turning the problem over and over in his mind, like a puzzle that refused to resolve into a clear picture. And here, to those of you who might find yourselves reading or hearing these words, comes a question worth considering. If you had been one of those men, stripped of pride by defeat on the battlefield and stripped of arrogance by abundance in a cafeteria, what would have broken you first and most completely? Would it have been the enemy's guns and bombs and overwhelming military force, or would it have been his food, the casual demonstration that he could afford to feed even you, his defeated enemy, better than your own nation had managed to feed its loyal citizens? The question matters because history is not just about the movement of armies across maps or the outcomes of battles. History is also about smaller moments, about the taste that lingers after the fighting ends, about the memories that shape how people understand what happened and why. By the second week of captivity, the cafeteria had transformed from a shocking novelty into simply routine, part of the rhythm of camp life. But while the daily visit became familiar, the underlying shock had not faded or diminished in the slightest. Each day the prisoners filed into that bright hall. Each day the trays clattered along the rails. Each day steam rose from pans that somehow never seemed to empty. Each day choices unfolded before them, like a quiet parade celebrating plenty rather than scarcity. The arrogance that had once wrapped their shoulders like a protective cloak, insulating them from the full implications of defeat, had grown thin and threadbare. Thread by thread, it had unraveled until even the proudest officers stood quietly in line, their expressions carefully neutral, trying not to reveal how thoroughly their certainties had been undermined. One particular Luftwaffe captain, a man known throughout the camp for his clipped manner of giving orders and his disdainful gaze when addressing anyone he considered inferior, was spotted one afternoon slipping back into the serving line for a second helping. His men watched in silence, and in that silence was a mixture of relief that they were not alone in their weakness and discomfort at seeing authority figures reduced to the same hunger-driven behavior that governed everyone. Pride was extraordinarily hard to maintain with any consistency when roast beef and fresh coffee and warm cornbread sat waiting only a few shuffling steps away, available to anyone willing to stand in line and accept what was offered. Another officer, a man who had once devoted an entire evening to lecturing the barracks on the theme of American vulgarity and cultural emptiness, was now observed holding his tray close to his chest with an almost protective posture, carefully balancing 2 slices of pie as he navigated back to his table. Nobody mocked him for this reversal. Nobody pointed out the contradiction between his previous pronouncements and his current behavior. Hunger, it turned out, had united them far more effectively than rank or ideology or nationalist fervor ever had. But there existed another dimension to the cafeteria experience that unsettled many of the prisoners even more deeply than the simple abundance, though they found it difficult to articulate exactly why. Behind the serving counters, handling the great pans of food and serving portions with practiced efficiency, stood not just white American cooks and mess workers, but also African American soldiers performing the same tasks, and sometimes even women in military uniform, all of them serving prisoners with a matter-of-fact professionalism that treated the work as just another duty to be performed. For men who had spent years being fed propaganda about racial hierarchy, about the supposed superiority of certain bloodlines and the inherent inferiority of others, this mundane scene carried implications that shook foundations they had not realized were unstable. To be handed food respectfully and without evident hostility by someone whom the entire ideology of their former regime had condemned as racially inferior, to receive service delivered with simple human dignity by people they had been taught to despise, disturbed them more deeply than many were willing to admit aloud. Whispers spread through the barracks that night after this realization had time to sink in, voices in the darkness processing what they had witnessed. Some prisoners muttered about shame, though they could not quite specify what exactly they felt ashamed of or why. Others deflected and made excuses, claiming it was just America's peculiar way of doing things, nothing that required them to reconsider their fundamental beliefs. But the silence of certain officers, men who would normally have been first and loudest to reinforce proper thinking, told its own story louder than words could have. The cafeteria was revealing itself to be not merely a place of physical abundance, but a daily reminder that the world they had believed in, a world of rigid order and carefully maintained hierarchies and assumed superiority, was collapsing with every spoonful of stew they accepted from hands they had been taught not to respect. Statistics that some of the more educated prisoners managed to learn only sharpened the sense of humiliation they were experiencing. Each camp cafeteria, they discovered, could serve literally thousands of meals within a single hour. Conveyor belt efficiency matched seamlessly with industrial might on a scale that was difficult to fully comprehend. At Camp Swift in Texas alone, official records documented that over 20,000 pounds of flour were transformed into bread each week, an amount that would have fed a German city for much longer than a week. The numbers were staggering when you actually contemplated them, relentless in their implications, undeniable in what they revealed about productive capacity. Where Germany had struggled to feed its own children adequately even before the bombing intensified, where mothers had performed daily miracles to stretch inadequate rations across hungry mouths, America was feeding its prisoners as casually as if scarcity was a concept that simply did not apply, as if abundance was the natural default state of existence. As the trays continued to clatter day after day and the line moved forward with its mechanical rhythm, many prisoners found themselves lost in uncomfortable thoughts during quiet moments. What did it actually mean to be fed so abundantly by an enemy who had every right and reason to hate them? Was this kindness, or was it domination dressed up as mercy, a demonstration of superiority far more effective than cruelty could ever be? A young corporal, educated enough to keep a diary despite the regulations against it, admitted in cramped handwriting that he had come to fear the food more than he feared the barbed wire surrounding the camp. The wire was just a physical barrier, easily understood. But the food, the endless, abundant food, made him forget his hatred a little more each day, made it harder to maintain the clear divisions between us and them that warfare required. And so, to anyone considering these events from the distance of decades, a question presents itself that deserves genuine contemplation. If you found yourself in captivity, if your captor chose to treat you not with the cruelty you might have expected, and perhaps even found easier to process, but instead with an abundance that exceeded what you had known even in freedom, would your loyalty to your previous beliefs and allegiances hold firm? Or would each meal weaken that loyalty, spoonful by spoonful, plate by plate, until you could no longer remember exactly what you had been so certain about before? It is worth pondering carefully, because embedded in that question lies one of the hidden weapons deployed in those American cafeterias. A weapon that required no ammunition and drew no blood, but achieved effects that lasted far longer than any conventional military victory. Autumn sunlight slanted across the prisoner compound at a new angle as the seasons began their inevitable turn, and when the cafeteria doors opened for yet another meal service, the scene had become so familiar that men barely looked up anymore. By this point in their captivity, the ritual had been thoroughly internalized. Everyone knew the routine by heart now, the familiar shuffle of boots across dust and then across polished floors, the gleam of steel trays catching overhead light, the rising steam of food that filled the air with aromas that had become almost comforting in their consistency. Yet beneath this surface familiarity, something more profound had shifted in ways the prisoners were only beginning to recognize. What had begun weeks ago as contemptuous laughter had transformed first into shock and awe, then gradually into uneasy acceptance, and now it lingered as memory being etched into the very marrow of men who had once sworn oaths of absolute allegiance to a regime that no longer existed. A grey-haired officer, a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front who had seen combat that still visited him in nightmares, sat quietly at a corner table one afternoon and held his tray as though it was some kind of sacred relic deserving reverence rather than just a piece of stamped steel. Before him lay the usual abundance that had somehow become routine: mashed potatoes whipped smooth, green beans that still retained their color, a generous slice of chocolate cake that glistened with frosting. He ate slowly, almost reverently, as if each bite carried a weight far beyond simple nutrition, as if every forkful represented a lesson he could not escape no matter how much he might wish to. Later that evening, back in the dim barracks, he whispered to a comrade he had known since before the war. They win not only with their guns and their tanks and their overwhelming numbers. They win with their ability to feed even their enemies, even us. We were wrong to laugh back at the beginning. We were wrong about so many things. The cafeteria itself had evolved in their collective consciousness into something symbolic, a kind of theater where abundance was performed daily for an audience that had not asked for tickets. Its very mechanics told a story. Steel trays sliding smoothly along worn rails, milk jugs clinking against one another as they were refilled, loaves of bread stacked in formations that seemed to replenish themselves magically, no matter how many were taken. All of it testified to something larger and more significant than mere taste or nutrition. This was industrial democracy in constant motion, a machine built not just to fight wars, but to nourish populations, including populations that had recently been trying to kill you. For the Germans watching and participating in this daily ritual, it became impossible to ignore or deny that such power, such casual, overwhelming productive capacity, made their once proud rituals of wine and sausages and formal toasts feel like echoes from a distant century, quaint customs preserved in amber, while the world moved on to something entirely different. Stories about the cafeteria meals began to spread beyond the physical fences of the camp itself. Some prisoners, after weeks had passed and the censors had relaxed slightly, wrote carefully worded letters to families back home. They had to be cautious, aware that every word would be read by authorities, but they found ways to hint that captivity was proving less brutal than anyone had feared. They wrote about having enough to eat, about variety in meals, about conditions that were tolerable and sometimes surprisingly comfortable. Others remained completely silent on the subject, carrying a shame they could not articulate, ashamed that their most vivid and haunting memory of the entire war was not the thunder of artillery or the screams of the wounded or the sight of cities burning, but rather the sheer abundance of an enemy cafeteria where they had eaten until full and then returned for more. The irony cut deeper the longer they contemplated it. The regime they had served had promised them supremacy, had told them they represented the pinnacle of civilization, had assured them of inevitable victory. But the lesson they would carry home when the war finally ended completely and prisoners began to be repatriated was not about supremacy at all. It was about humiliation, but a strange kind of humiliation that came not from deprivation, but from generosity, not from cruelty, but from the casual offer of second helpings. Years would pass, The immediate hardships of war would recede, cities would be rebuilt from rubble, and lives would slowly return to something resembling normalcy. But when these former prisoners became old men, when they sat with grandchildren and tried to explain what the war had been like, they found themselves speaking less frequently about battles and tactics, and more often about meals. A particular former soldier, decades after his release, told his wide-eyed grandson a story not about tanks rolling across fields or planes screaming through the sky, but about the specific day when he had mocked the very idea of an American cafeteria, laughed at how crude it would surely be, only to stand in line later that same day, speechless before more food than he had seen in months, and then, swallowing his pride, returning to that same line to ask for seconds. His voice trembled slightly as he described in precise detail the clatter of trays being stacked, the seemingly endless flood of milk being poured, the unexpected sweetness of American cornbread that had tasted like some exotic delicacy to a palate accustomed to scarcity. That image, he admitted, had stayed with him more vividly than the crack of rifles or the roar of engines. It had revealed something about the true scale of American power that no amount of propaganda could have prepared him for. And so this particular story reaches its conclusion not with the thunder of explosions or the drama of fire sweeping across battlefields, but with a quieter and more lasting image. A shining steel tray piled high with food, sitting under the hard, unwavering glow of electric light in a building designed for the efficient feeding of masses. For the prisoners who had initially scoffed and sneered and mocked, who had been so certain of their cultural superiority, that tray represented a weapon more powerful than any cannon they had faced. It was a lesson that traveled with them across the ocean when they were finally sent home, a lesson that persisted through the decades as they aged and tried to make sense of what they had lived through. The lesson was simple but profound. Abundance itself, the sheer ability to provide without apparent strain or sacrifice, could break down walls of pride and arrogance more surely and more permanently than any bomb ever dropped from the sky. History teaches its lessons through many methods. Sometimes those lessons arrive with noise and violence, announced by the roar of cannons and the thunder of engines and the shouts of armies clashing in fields. But sometimes, perhaps more often than we recognize, history's deepest and most lasting lessons arrive quietly. They come in the mundane clatter of trays against rails, in the rising steam of food drifting through a hall filled with bright light, in the simple, overwhelming fact of having enough to eat. The story of German prisoners who once mocked what they imagined American cafeterias would be, only to find themselves standing humbly in line for second helpings and then third, serves as a reminder that power expresses itself through many channels. It is not always or even primarily about violence and the capacity to destroy. Sometimes, power reveals itself most completely in the ability to nourish, to sustain, to provide without any visible fear of scarcity or resource depletion. For the men who lived through this experience, who carried it with them through the remainder of the war, and then through their return to a devastated homeland, and then through decades of rebuilding and reflection, the cafeteria became a memory that cut deeper than battlefield trauma. It had stripped away carefully constructed layers of pride and revealed just how fragile ideology becomes when confronted with the simple physical reality of ordinary abundance. The regime had promised them so many things, supremacy and discipline and order and ultimate victory, but it had failed to deliver the most basic necessity. It could not fill their stomachs. America, with its vast fields stretching beyond sight and its tireless factories running day and night, had offered something that their own nation, for all its grandiose claims, had been unable to provide. America had demonstrated a vision of plenty so vast and so casual that it extended even to defeated enemies, even to men who had fought to destroy everything the United States represented. In the years that followed their release and repatriation, When those prisoners finally returned home to cities still clearing rubble and families still struggling with rations, many of them carried an uncomfortable paradox lodged in their hearts. They had been defeated utterly in war, stripped of weapons and agency and national pride. Yet in captivity, they had been fed better than they had eaten in years, perhaps better than they had ever eaten in their lives. They had laughed at the prospect of eating like children, had mocked American crudeness and vulgarity, yet they had discovered dignity in the revolutionary act of choosing their own meals from abundant options, of being treated as individuals rather than as interchangeable units in a hierarchy, and in the stillness of old age, when the sharper memories of combat had blurred into generalized impressions and specific battles had run together into an undifferentiated stream of violence. It was not always the battlefield that occupied their thoughts when they drifted into remembrance. An old soldier, sitting in a quiet room decades after the last shot was fired, once remarked to anyone willing to listen that he could still hear with perfect clarity the specific sound of trays sliding along metal rails, that distinctive metallic whisper that had accompanied every meal for weeks and months of captivity. To him, even after all the intervening years had passed, that sound represented a truth he had been forced to accept, but could never entirely reconcile with what he had been taught to believe. The truth was stark and simple. Strength and power are measured not only in weapons stockpiled and armies mobilized, but perhaps more fundamentally in the quiet, relentless capacity of a society to feed even its enemies, to demonstrate through the simple medium of abundant food that its resources dwarf any challenger's ability to compete. The cafeteria had been their classroom, and abundance had been their teacher. And the lesson, though learned reluctantly and with great resistance, had proven impossible to forget across a lifetime of remembering.